The mist arrived early that evening, uninvited and stubborn, pressing itself into every alley and garden wall of Flaxborough. By 6:30, the lamplighter on Market Street had vanished entirely from view, though his gentle tapping could still be heard, steady as an old clock. Halloween in Flaxborough was not the noisy, candle-glowing affair it was elsewhere. The children were polite, the tricks modest, and the treats usually involved ginger biscuits shaped like cats. The church clock, muffled by fog, struck 7, and from each neat row of houses came the warm pulse of life. Wireless music, kettle whistles, the smell of roast parsnips. Mrs. Glossop, of 14 Juniper Crescent, was midway through slicing a seed cake when her doorbell rang. She assumed it was young Neville from next door, who had promised to appear as a pirate. She dabbed her hands on her apron, smiled at her reflection in the hall mirror, and opened the door. The man standing there was not a child. He was tall, spare, and pale, with a coat that looked as though it had been carefully brushed for the occasion. In his hand he held a black hat. His expression was polite, faintly apologetic, as though interrupting a thought. "Good evening," he said softly.
"I seem to have come home," Mrs. Glossop blinked.
"I beg your pardon?" He looked past her, into the hallway, toward the row of family photographs on the wall. One in particular, the wedding portrait of her late sister Evelyn and her first husband, caught his attention. The man's smile trembled slightly. "That was taken on a very warm day," he murmured. "July 1958. I remember the carnations." Mrs. Glossop's hand slipped from the doorknob.
Who are you?"
"Leonard Draycott," he said. "I live here." The name struck her like cold air. Leonard Draycott had drowned 5 years ago. His funeral had been held at St. Jude's, his coffin closed. Evelyn had worn black for 6 months, and then, with the encouragement of friends, married Mr. Pike, the bank manager. Mrs. Glossop stepped back. The mist behind him seemed to move, curling about his shoulders like smoke. You can't be," she whispered.
"You're dead." Draycott tilted his head slightly, as though considering the matter. "I rather thought so myself," he said.
"But it appears I was mistaken." He placed his hat neatly on the hall table and walked inside. The smell of seed cake and polished wood met him like an old tune. Somewhere in the distance, fireworks cracked faintly over the park. Mrs. Glossop stood frozen, one hand at her throat, watching as he studied the framed photographs, the polished banister, the umbrella stand that had belonged to his father. "I hope Evelyn's well," he said quietly. Mrs. Glossop found her voice only long enough to murmur that she would fetch the police. "Of course," Draycott said, smiling thinly. "It's only proper." When Inspector Purbright received the call 20 minutes later, he was just locking his office. Halloween seldom required police intervention, save for the occasional pumpkin theft or spirited youth with a penknife. The word corpse in the message made him pause mid-step. He sighed, took his coat from the peg, and muttered to Sergeant Love, who had been nursing a mug of tea.
"Seems the dead are keeping busy tonight, love." By the time Purbright arrived at Juniper Crescent, the mist had thickened.
He could see the yellow square of Mrs. Glossop's window long before he could see the house itself. Inside, she sat rigid in her armchair, pale as her lace curtains. Draycott, for his part, was seated opposite, calmly stirring sugar into his tea. Purbright paused in the doorway, his hat still in hand. The room was utterly still, save for the tick of the mantel clock. "Well," he said mildly, "we do like a seasonal touch of drama in Flaxborough, but I suspect this exceeds our usual standards." Draycott rose, extended a polite hand, and introduced himself as though meeting a neighbour. Purbright studied him closely. The man's face bore the faint, sea-worn texture of someone who had lived hard years, but there was nothing ghostly in it. Only fatigue and perhaps regret. "You've been dead for quite some time, Mr. Draycott," Purbright observed. "So I gather," came the reply. "I was misinformed." Purbright regarded him for a moment longer, then nodded toward the teapot.
In that case, he said, we'd better have another cup.
I imagine it's been a long walk home. Outside, the fog pressed closer to the windows, as if listening. By dawn, the fog had thinned, though it lingered along the hedgerows like the hem of a forgotten cloak. The town awoke to news that needed no newspaper to spread. Mrs. Glossop's telephone had rung past midnight. By breakfast, half of Flaxborough knew that a dead man had come calling in Juniper Crescent. At the bakery, the story was kneaded with the dough. At the post office, it was weighed and stamped with speculation. In the snug corner of the Royal George, where early risers took their tea before work, it had already acquired 3 endings and a moral. Some said the man was a lunatic escaped from a hospital in Norwich. Others insisted it was a cruel impersonation,
meant to distress Mrs. Pike. One version, the
favourite among those who liked their mysteries with a supernatural edge,
had the fellow stepping straight out of his own grave.
Under the influence of Halloween forces, Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, sat in his office with a cup of black tea, cooling beside a modest pile of reports. He had heard 4 accounts already, each delivered with the same confidential whisper, as though truth were contagious. Sergeant Love stood by the window, trying and failing to suppress a grin. Mrs. Glossop says he knew the exact colour of her sister's wedding dress, Love reported. Can't think how a stranger might have guessed that. Few things travel faster than small-town memory, Purbright replied. He reached for his pen, tapping it once against the blotter. Especially when lace and lilies are involved, Love chuckled, then hesitated. You don't think he really, well, that he could be? No, said Purbright gently. The dead are rarely punctual enough to arrive at tea time. Outside, a bicycle bell chimed. 2 women passed along the pavement, voices rising like birdsong in the cold air. Came back from the sea, I heard. Not possible. They found his hat floating, didn't they? Well, hats float. Bodies don't, not for 5 years. Purbright closed his eyes briefly. The rhythm of gossip had its own comfort. Predictable, circular, and strangely innocent. He wondered, not for the first time, whether the town's appetite for mystery made his own work redundant. At 9:30, he pulled on his coat and walked toward Juniper Crescent. The morning had the stillness peculiar to days after excitement. Windows twitched as he passed, lace veils lifting like the blink of 1,000 discreet eyes. Mrs. Glossop received him with the composure of a woman who had already repeated her tale 12 times. Her drawing-room smelled faintly of lavender and nerves. He was polite, Inspector. Perfectly polite. That's what frightened me most. She set down a plate of untouched biscuits. He spoke of Evelyn as though he'd just seen her.
Asked if the garden still had roses.
It was him, I'm certain, Purbright nodded. And he left of his own accord? Yes, said he'd find his way. I locked the door after him. Did he take anything? Only his hat. Left the cup quite full. Purbright glanced toward the empty teacup on the side table, the spoon resting diagonally as though carefully arranged. He noted it quietly.
And you haven't heard from him since?
Not a sound. He thanked her and stepped out into the pale light. Across the street, curtains stirred again. A child's laughter carried faintly through the mist. Somewhere a bell from St. Jude's tolled the half-hour. As he walked, he considered the facts that were not yet facts. Leonard Draycott, clerk, husband, drowned man.
5 years gone.
Nobody found, only a verdict that had satisfied the insurers. The widow remarried, her grief replaced by domestic stability. Now the drowned man reappeared, breathing and articulate. Purbright's breath clouded the air. He could almost hear the town whispering around him, its collective imagination rustling like dry leaves. At the corner of High Street, he stopped by the window of Ridley's Butcher's. 2 customers were leaning close to the counter, the conversation as vivid as the day's cuts. Couldn't be him. He'd be all bones by now. My cousin in Ipswich swears they can do that. New skin. Grafting, all sorts. Grafting won't fix dead. The butcher. Eavesdropping cheerfully, caught Purbright's eye and gave a conspiratorial wink. Back at the station, the morning post had arrived, a thin envelope marked private and urgent. Inside lay a single note, unsigned, with neat handwriting. He wasn't meant to come back. Purbright stared at the words, their restraint more alarming than any threat. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his notebook. Love entered with 2 mugs of tea and the cautious look of someone who'd heard too much already. "Sir, I've checked the old Draycott file. Missing presumed drowned, no body, as you said. The coroner accepted identification based on a wallet found near the canal bridge."
Insurance paid out within a fortnight. Quick business, Purbright murmured.
"Who handled it?" "Broker's name was Simpkins. Retired to Dorset, according to the records." Purbright leaned back.
5 years of quiet.
Then the man reappears on All Hallows' Eve, just long enough to remind everyone he existed. Either a remarkable coincidence or a carefully chosen date. Love frowned. "You think he planned it?" "I think," said Purbright, "that people who vanish seldom return without a reason, and those who help them vanish often wish they hadn't." He rose, buttoned his coat once more, and moved toward the door. The day outside had turned thin and silvery, the last wisps of fog dissolving into a brittle kind of sunlight. As he stepped into the street, he caught sight of Mrs. Pike herself, crossing toward the grocer's, wrapped in mourning colours far too sombre for an ordinary morning. Her head was bowed, but even from a distance, Purbright saw the tremor in her hands. He did not call to her, not yet. Instead, he stood a moment longer, watching the town breathe in its latest scandal. Genteel, hungry, and oddly alive. Somewhere, behind the soft hum of ordinary life, he felt the faintest stir of unease. The dead, after all, rarely walk twice. The church bell struck 10. The sound carried through the still air, folded into every whispered retelling, as if Flaxborough itself were holding its breath. And in a narrow lane behind the post office, a shadow moved, slow, deliberate, before slipping soundlessly into the mist. Inspector Purbright found Mrs. Pike's figure still lingering in his mind as he returned to the station. The way she had crossed the street, measured, self-contained, as though balancing invisible weights, had the restraint of someone who had long rehearsed composure, the kind that cracked only in private. He spent the next hour reviewing Draycott's file in the pale quiet of his office. The paper smelled faintly of damp and dust, the scent of bureaucratic sleep. Missing person, 1960, last seen leaving the Royal George after an argument about unpaid rent. A hat found by the canal. Wallet retrieved downstream 2 days later. Widow identified the contents. Case closed by mutual relief. The door creaked. Sergeant Love appeared, pink-cheeked from the chill. "Mrs. Glossop's in reception, sir. Says she's remembered something important." Purbright nodded. "Good. Let's not keep the conscience waiting." He found her perched on the edge of a wooden chair, gloved hands clenched around a folded handkerchief. The faint rustle of the town drifted in through the half-open window, bicycle wheels, a distant cough, the bell of the greengrocer's door. "Inspector," she began breathlessly. "I've remembered what he said. After I told him Evelyn was remarried, he looked, well, not angry, more puzzled, as though the idea didn't fit." "Did he speak her new name?" She frowned. "Yes, he said Mrs. Pike," then laughed a little, softly, as if at himself, and said he was glad she'd kept the house looking neat. "Neatness is a comfort to the unsettled," Purbright murmured. "Did he say where he was going next?" "No, but he mentioned the canal bridge. Said something about the water being lower than he remembered." Purbright looked up. "Lower?" She nodded, uncertain. "I thought he was rambling. He seemed confused, But he was gentle, Inspector. Not mad, not threatening, just misplaced. Purbright thanked her and escorted her out. When the door closed, Love leaned in. "Shall I send a constable to the canal, sir?" "In a while," said Purbright. "First, I'd like to see where the ghosts drink tea, the Pike residence." Lay 2 streets away from the canal, a brick house with a garden too meticulously trimmed for its own comfort. The curtains were half drawn despite the noon light. When Purbright knocked, the sound seemed to linger, muffled by thick air. Mrs. Pike opened the door with the composure of someone expecting a visitor, but not this one. Her expression carried a restrained civility, the sort that can fracture without warning. "Inspector Purbright," she said, "how very conscientious of you." "I'm afraid duty is a poor substitute for tact," he replied gently. "May I come in?" The hallway smelled of beeswax and old carnations. She led him into a sitting room where the fire had burned too long, leaving the air heavy with smoke. He noticed 2 teacups on the sideboard, one rinsed clean, one half full and cold. "I understand your late husband has returned," he said. She did not sit. "You understand incorrectly." "Ah." Purbright examined the unlit corner of the room. "Then Mrs. Glossop must be mistaken." "She's excitable." "True," he conceded, "but she seldom invents dead men." For the first time, her eyes met his fully. There was no fear in them, only a strained weariness. "Leonard died, Inspector. He fell into the canal on a cold night." "The police said so. You—" She hesitated. "You signed the report yourself." "I did," Purbright agreed. "And yet someone answering to his name, face, and voice has since taken tea in your sister's parlour. He remembers your wedding, your garden, even your roses. All very inconvenient details for an impostor." A faint tremor ran through her shoulders. She turned away, pretending to straighten a framed photograph on the mantel. In it, a younger Evelyn smiled beside Leonard Draycott, his expression mild, uncertain, almost apologetic. "When people die," she said quietly, "others find ways to resemble them. We see what we wish to see." "Some do," Purbright said. "Others arrange to be seen again." She looked back at him sharply. "You think this man is Leonard?" "I think he believes he is."
Or wants someone to believe it. The clock on the mantel clicked once, then again, marking the silence between them. "Where is Mr. Pike this morning?" Purbright asked. "Business trip," she said quickly. "Not that it concerns you." "Everything concerns me when the dead start keeping appointments."
She flinched, then managed a brittle smile. "I see Flaxborough hasn't lost its appetite for drama." "It's not drama that interests me," said Purbright. "Only motive. A man does not stay gone 5 years without reason. Nor does he return without purpose." Her hands tightened around the edge of the mantelpiece. Perhaps he wanted forgiveness, or something more negotiable. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. The sound of a passing carriage broke the moment, wheels hissing over damp cobblestones. Purbright studied her a moment longer, then nodded once. "If your late husband should happen to call again, I would appreciate a message before you offer him refreshment." He turned toward the door. Her voice followed him, brittle as frost. "Inspector, if he truly is Leonard, what do you intend to do?" He paused, his hand on the doorknob. "That rather depends," he said softly, "on what he's come home for." Outside, the sky had dulled to pewter. The mist had thinned, but its memory clung to every surface. As Purbright walked toward the canal, the faint smell of silt and iron rose in the chill air. Near the bridge, he stopped. The water below was slow, opaque, faintly rippled by fallen leaves. Along the embankment stood a figure in a dark coat, head bowed as though reading something invisible in the current. Purbright approached without haste, his shoes crunching on the damp gravel. The man turned. It was Leonard Draycott. Up close, he looked older than his photograph, weathered, hollow-eyed, but unmistakably alive. "Good afternoon," said Purbright, voice calm. Draycott smiled faintly. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten me, Inspector." "Not at all. The paperwork was rather memorable." Draycott chuckled softly. "Ah, yes, bureaucracy, the final resting place of most Englishmen." "You've caused some alarm," said Purbright.
"You people don't like rearrangements of the dead." "I never meant to cause alarm. I simply came back." "Back from where?" Draycott looked toward the water, its surface bruised with reflection. "Away," he said. "Just away. You wouldn't believe how long away can be."
Purbright studied him in silence. "And your wife?" "She did what she had to." His voice was low, almost kind. "It's easier to mourn than to explain." "Explain what?" Draycott met his gaze, the fog catching faintly in his breath. "That sometimes a man disappears to keep others safe. And sometimes—" He stopped, glancing toward the distant row of houses. "Sometimes he comes back too soon." A church bell tolled behind them, muffled but insistent. Purbright watched, the man's hands steady, deliberate, as he placed his hat back on his head. "If you don't mind, Inspector," said Draycott quietly, "I'd rather not be dead just yet." Purbright inclined his head. "In Flaxborough, Mr. Draycott, that's rarely our decision." The wind stirred the reeds by the canal. Somewhere beyond, a shutter banged softly, then stilled. They stood there a long moment, two silhouettes against the pale water, while the town, polite as ever, pretended not to notice. By the following morning, Flaxborough had achieved what it did best, a state of composed disbelief. The incident at Juniper Crescent, which only a day before had fluttered through every parlour and tea shop, was now wrapped neatly in the paper of local reason. It had been a mistake, they decided. The man was not Leonard Draycott at all, but a traveller of uncanny resemblance. The season lent itself to tricks, after all. Halloween had always encouraged masks, and fog distorted faces as easily as it did truth. At the Royal George, where yesterday's incredulity had been poured liberally with the ale, calm had returned to the bar. "A tramp," said Mr. Riddle the publican, wiping the counter with a dish-rag, scented faintly of beer and reassurance. "Heard he was after charity. Probably spun that yarn for sympathy." His regulars nodded gravely, each adopting the expression of one who had suspected as much from the beginning. "Yes, well," murmured Mr. Clegg from the corner. "Some people'll say anything for a night indoors." By noon, the vicar of St. Jude's had declared the whole affair a lesson in humility. In his Sunday sermon, he cautioned against placing our faith in appearances, for even a ghost can be explained by fog and fatigue. The congregation listened with mild relief, nodding in rhythm to the certainty of human error. Mrs. Glossop, who attended twice that week, took comfort in the vicar's tone, though she still locked her door before dusk. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, was less at ease. He spent the afternoon in his office, gazing through the frosted window at the slow drift of leaves along the pavement. Sergeant Love sat opposite, turning the pages of the Draycott file with the reverence of a man handling scripture. "The town's made up its mind, sir," he said finally. "They've all agreed it wasn't him." "Seems the simplest answer." Purbright murmured. "Simplicity has its seductions." He tapped the file with one finger, frowning slightly. "No body, love, no eyewitness, no medical confirmation." Merely a wallet with a photograph and a watch that kept poor time.
It's astonishing how thoroughly people will bury a man they haven't seen die. Love gave a small shrug.
Perhaps they wanted him gone. Perhaps, said Purbright softly. It spares one the awkwardness of truth. A silence drifted between them. Outside, a church bell rang 3 times. Slow, deliberate. Purbright rose, crossed to the window, and watched the fog begin to thicken once more over the canal road. "Sir," Love ventured, "you saw him yourself."
That fellow at the bridge.
What if he really is Leonard Draycott? Purbright turned, his expression unreadable. Then I should like to know why the dead man looked so very alive, and why his widow did not seem surprised enough to faint. He paused, as if listening to something only he could hear. When a person sees a ghost and lives to tell it, one must always ask, which of them is haunting whom? Later that evening, Purbright took a slow walk through the town. The streets, dimly lit, were calm again, the sort of calm that follows a collectively agreed story. Shop shutters were drawn, doors bolted, and behind the curtained glow of each window, conversation flickered in warm, well-behaved tones. A bicycle coasted past, its tires whispering on the damp cobbles. Somewhere, a piano played a tune from before the war, hesitant but comforting. At the corner by the milliner's, Purbright encountered Mr. Beamish, a retired solicitor who regarded gossip as both a vice and a necessity. "Terrible business, Inspector," he said, adjusting his scarf. "All this talk of revenants. You must find it quite wearisome." "I try not to," Purbright replied, "though I do admire the town's efficiency. Most places require months to misremember an event. Here we manage it overnight," Beamish chuckled. "Yes, well, we're a practical people."
Easier to live with a misunderstanding than a miracle. "Quite," said Purbright.
"Though I wonder if the distinction is as clear as it appears." He tipped his hat and moved on, leaving the solicitor blinking after him. The wind carried the faint scent of coal smoke and the church's evening incense. Crossing the canal bridge, Purbright paused again. The water below was black and still, the reflection of the gas lamps trembling on its surface. He leaned over the railing, studying the slow pulse of light against the current. Somewhere in that dark mirror, he thought, truth was drifting. Weightless, unanchored, patient. A faint rustle caught his ear. From the far bank, where reeds bent in the wind, came the sound of movement, cautious, deliberate. He watched as a figure emerged briefly in the lamplight, a man in a dark coat, hat pulled low. The shape paused, then turned down the towpath, vanishing into the fog. Purbright straightened, his expression unreadable. The air smelled faintly of river iron and old leaves. When he returned to the station, the evening was nearly still. Love had gone, leaving a note on the desk, a list of inquiries made, all inconclusive. Purbright sat, drew his notebook closer, and began to write in his small, neat hand the living construct fictions to contain fear. The dead, if they return at all, do so to collect unpaid truths. He closed the book and leaned back, listening to the building's quiet. The tick of the radiator, the faint hum of distant conversation drifting through the open window. Outside, Flaxborough exhaled its relief. The matter to most was settled, the ghost explained away. The dead, politely reseated among memory and myth, and yet, beneath that neat calm, Purbright sensed something restless, a truth not content to stay buried. It moved unseen like the water beneath the bridge, waiting for the next sound to disturb its surface. He switched off the desk lamp, leaving the room in half-light. The town clock struck 9. In the pause that followed, the faintest echo reached him. A knock, far away, 3 measured raps against wood. Then silence, long and deliberate, as if the night itself were holding its breath. The knock echoed once, twice, then faded into the building's slow breathing. Purbright waited, motionless in the half-dark, before striking a match and relighting the lamp. The small flames spread across the polished wood, steadying his thoughts. Somewhere beyond the window, the canal murmured like a patient whisperer. He reached for the old Draycott file again, the one whose spine cracked faintly in protest each time it was opened, and spread its contents like a séance across the desk. Photographs, statements, official memoranda, everything dutiful, tidy, and incomplete. The report dated November 1960, disappearance presumed fatal. Search discontinued owing to adverse conditions and lack of evidence. Beneath, the coroner's neat signature, already fading to sepia. He read it twice. The phrasing was cautious, professional distance veiling a lack of conviction. Flaxborough, he thought, had always preferred resolution to accuracy. He turned to the insurance file, a later edition clipped to the back. $2,000 paid in full to Mrs. Evelyn Draycott, widow, within 14 days of the verdict. He frowned. 14 days was brisk, almost indecently so. The broker's signature, Harold Simpkins, was thick and slanted. The ink bled through slightly. Yet something in its tail, the downward curve of the S, tugged at him. Purbright adjusted his glasses, tracing it lightly with his finger. Then he drew from a separate folder the record of Evelyn's remarriage to Mr. Albert Pike. 2 documents, 2 signatures, both witnessed by the same hand. He smiled faintly, though there was no humour in it. "Convenient fellow, Mr. Simpkins," he murmured. The clock on the wall gave a thin metallic cough, then struck 10. The sound folded into the silence like a small confession. Footsteps approached in the corridor, hesitant, careful, before Sergeant Love's head appeared around the door. "You're still at it, sir? I thought you'd gone home hours ago." "Home," Purbright said, without looking up, "is where one goes when the past is safely buried. Flaxborough, I fear, is rather shallow ground." Love entered, peering at the papers. "That the Draycott file again?" "It is."
"And the handwriting's beginning to trouble me more than the corpse," Love blinked. "Sir?" Purbright leaned back, eyes narrowing with mild amusement.
"Tell me, Love, if you'd been missing, presumed drowned, and your wife received your life insurance within a fortnight, wouldn't you consider that remarkably efficient service?" Love hesitated. "Well, I suppose—" "Exactly," Purbright interrupted. "No one supposes. They accept. They sign. They file."
"Then they forget."
"Flaxborough thrives on forgetting. It oils the social gears." He reached into the folder again and withdrew a thin envelope, yellowed at the edges. The original witness statement of Mrs. Evelyn Draycott. Her handwriting, neat as a school essay, declared, "My husband had lately been despondent. He spoke of debts. He left the house at dusk and did not return." Purbright reread the line twice, his lips forming the words silently. Debts. Not grief, not fear. Debts. Love was still standing, uncertain.
"Do you think he really drowned, sir?"
"I think," Purbright said, "he very nearly did, though perhaps not in water." He pushed the insurance form toward the lamp. "Look here. The witness on this claim, Simpkins again, signed in the same hand that witnessed her remarriage. Curious consistency, don't you think?" Love squinted. "Could just be coincidence." "Yes, a comforting one." Purbright rose, moving to the window. Outside, the mist had gathered again, sliding between lampposts like unhurried smoke. "Simpkins retired to Dorset, you said?" "That's right. Left the firm 2 years after the claim. Then he might still be alive enough to remember what he signed, if we ask politely." Love's face brightened. "Shall I send a letter?" "No, love. Letters are for people who have nothing to hide. We'll make a call in the morning." He turned back toward the desk, gathering the scattered papers into order. "Do we have Draycott's bank records?" "Just 1 page. Account closed the week after he vanished. Balance withdrawn by Mrs. Draycott, with probate approval." Purbright tapped the file thoughtfully. "She was thorough, I'll grant her that. Efficient, too."
"I wonder where she learned it." The sound of the building settling filled the pause, faint creaks, the slow sigh of an old radiator.
The kind of silence that encouraged thinking or guilt. "Sir," said Love cautiously, "you don't think Mrs. Pike had anything to do with him disappearing, do you?" Purbright smiled faintly as though at a student eager for the answer before the lesson. When people profit from absence, Love, they seldom rush to confirm a return. He closed the file, extinguished the lamp, and stood in the amber glow from the corridor. "We'll pay her another visit tomorrow. I fancy she'll be expecting us, though she won't know why." Love followed him out, his footsteps echoing along the polished floor. At the far end of the corridor, a window rattled faintly in the wind, and from somewhere beyond the courtyard came the sound of water dripping into a metal gutter. Slow.
Regular, unending. Purbright paused at the door, listening.
"There's a pattern to everything, Love," he said quietly. "Even deceit leaves footprints. You just have to wait until the mud dries." Outside, the night had cooled to that breathless stillness peculiar to English towns after gossip has gone to bed. A single light burned in the Pike house across the square, its glow wavering through lace curtains. Purbright watched it a moment, the corners of his mouth tightening in thought. Then he turned up his collar, exhaled a faint cloud into the mist, and walked away, unhurried, his shoes marking each step like the ticking of a careful clock. Behind him, the canal whispered again, soft as memory, and from somewhere out of sight, a church bell chimed once, a note so small it might have been mistaken for coincidence, were it not for the way the sound lingered, steady and unresolved, long after the echo should have died. The following morning dawned pale and brittle, the kind of light that exposes imperfections in glass and conscience alike. A faint drizzle silvered the pavements, and the canal mist hung low, moving only when disturbed by a passing lorry or the cautious wingbeat of a crow. Inspector Purbright, wrapped in his overcoat and patience, walked the short distance to Crescent Road. The Pike house stood at the end of the terrace, discreetly distinguished by a gleaming brass knocker in the shape of a lion's head. The garden, though neat from afar, carried the look of recent upheaval. Earth darker in patches, the soil mounded and uneven, as if the ground itself had shifted uneasily in its sleep. He paused a moment, noting a spade propped against the fence, the blade still moist with mud. Then he rapped gently on the lion's head. Mrs. Evelyn Pike answered, with the poise of a woman who had been expecting either a visitor or a confession. She was dressed immaculately in grey, her hair drawn tight at the nape, and her expression one of courteous composure. Only her hands betrayed her, fingers restless, worrying the corner of her sleeve. "Inspector Purbright," she said, her voice a degree too calm.
"I thought we had exhausted this little resurrection." "Good morning, Mrs. Pike," he replied, bowing his head slightly.
"In my experience, resurrections rarely end tidily. May I come in?" She stepped aside with the faintest sigh. The hallways smelled of beeswax, lavender, and something sharper. Carbolic, perhaps. The scent of a house too determined to appear clean. "Mr. Pike is away, I believe?" Purbright asked, as she led him into the sitting room. "Business in Nottingham," she said, glancing toward the clock on the mantel.
"He left 2 days ago. I expect him back tonight." Purbright nodded, his eyes moving gently over the room.
Everything was orderly, lace curtains drawn to equal measure, 2 teacups set precisely on the tray, one untouched. On the hearth, a small pile of ash had been swept too carefully to be casual. "I see you've been busy in the garden," he remarked. Her back stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Albert takes pride in it. He believes a tidy garden reflects a tidy mind. And you?" "I prefer flowers," he smiled faintly. "A difference of philosophy, then." "Still, the roses are holding well for the season." She turned sharply, eyes narrowing. "Inspector, is there a purpose to these compliments?" "Observation, Mrs. Pike," he said mildly, taking the offered seat. A dangerous habit of mine. She poured tea with steady hands. The delicate chime of porcelain filled the pause. I won't waste your time, Purbright continued. The matter of Leonard Draycott's reappearance, or rather, the man claiming to be him, has left us with a small complication.
Officially, you remain his widow, which makes your current marriage.
Administratively adventurous, her face whitened slightly. You mean bigamous? Technically, he said, though I imagine unintentionally so. If, of course, the gentleman is genuine. She set her cup down too quickly. The saucer rattled once. He isn't. I told you before, Leonard is dead. I buried him, at least as far as the law permitted. Purbright studied her in the soft half-light. And yet, 5 years on, a man walks into Flaxborough, who knows your house, your roses, your sister's cake, even the colour of your wedding dress.
That's a remarkable coincidence. She looked away.
Coincidence can be cruel, indeed, though it usually lacks such detail. He leaned forward, his tone gentle but firm. Mrs. Pike, when your husband disappeared, there were debts. Substantial ones, according to his employer's notes. But the insurance claim was settled with unusual speed. 2 weeks, in fact. You must have found that convenient. She met his gaze then, her voice low but steady. I did what I was advised to do. Mr. Simpkins handled everything. He said the firm was satisfied that Leonard's death was beyond doubt. Simpkins. Purbright allowed the name to settle between them. A useful man from all accounts. Did he visit often? Twice, perhaps. To collect forms. To assure me I'd be taken care of. Ah, said Purbright softly.
And you were. She stood abruptly, crossing to the window.
Outside, the drizzle had thickened into rain, tracing the glass like ghostly handwriting.
You think I planned it? She said.
You think I helped him disappear? I think, Purbright replied, that love and desperation make capable partners. She turned, eyes bright with sudden defiance. Leonard was a weak man, Inspector. He couldn't bear his failures.
I pitied him, I still do.
But when they said he'd fallen into the canal, I was relieved. That's the truth, relieved. Purbright regarded her for a moment longer, then rose. And yet, when he returned, you weren't relieved again. She hesitated, a tremor passing through her voice. It wasn't him.
It can't be.
He looked hollow, like something returned from a dream that should have stayed asleep. He stepped toward the door. Dreams seldom drown, Mrs. Pike. They have an uncanny habit of resurfacing. As he reached for his hat, her composure faltered.
Inspector! He stopped, turning back. There's something you should know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper.
The night before he
vanished, he said he'd found a way to make everything right.
He told me not to worry if I didn't see him again. He said I'd be looked after. By whom? He never said. Only that it was safer that way. Purbright's expression softened.
And now?
She lowered her gaze. Now I think whatever he meant by safe was borrowed time. He inclined his head, polite as ever. Thank you, Mrs. Pike. I suspect we may soon find out who lent it. Outside, the rain had begun to drum gently on the pavement, a soft percussion against the calm of the street. As Purbright stepped onto the path, he glanced once more at the garden. The soil gleamed darkly, the rain forming tiny craters that filled, closed, and vanished again. He walked slowly toward the canal, the umbrella swinging lightly in his hand. The air smelled of wet stone and faint smoke from nearby chimneys. From somewhere in the distance, a whistle blew. The late train bound east. At the bridge, he paused, glancing down at the water. It was higher now, restless under the rain, the colour of tarnished pewter. Near the bank, something pale drifted momentarily before the current carried it away. A scrap of cloth, perhaps, or a memory refusing to sink. Behind him, the town stirred. Doors closing, lamps dimming, the last murmur of conversation fading into the rhythm of falling rain. Purbright watched the water a moment longer, then turned back toward the station. He would write to Dorset in the morning, a short, courteous note to Mr. Harold Simpkins, retired insurance broker, and he would ask about a signature. But tonight he allowed himself one last thought, quiet and precise. In Flaxborough, even the ground kept secrets, some buried beneath roses, some beneath rain, and some, he suspected, buried themselves. Rain fell through the night like a long conversation no one wished to end. By midnight, it had softened to a persistent whisper against the roofs of Flaxborough, settling over the town in that damp, uncertain stillness which holds more than it reveals. Inspector Purbright sat in his office, the single desk lamp burning a small island of amber in the gloom. The letter to Dorset lay sealed beside him, his handwriting even and unhurried. He would send it at first light. For now, the quiet had its own kind of eloquence. The soft tick of the clock, the far hum of the telephone lines, and the faint scent of rain on stone. He was considering the puzzle of motive when the door creaked open and Sergeant Love entered, hair dripping from the weather. His expression was apologetic, though not surprised, a look Flaxborough constables wore when fate had once again chosen poor timing. "Sorry to disturb you, sir," he said, closing the door gently behind him. "There's been a report from the Canal Road. A coat's been found. Looks like the same business again." Purbright sighed quietly, stood and reached for his hat. "The dead," he murmured, "are developing a tiresome sense of routine." They walked in silence through the misting rain. The town was mostly asleep, though the occasional window glowed faintly, betraying a sleepless watcher or a nervous cat. Water gurgled in the drains, and somewhere a shutter flapped with weary insistence. At the bridge, the constable's lantern cast a trembling circle over the embankment. The coat lay there, folded with deliberate care, the collar turned in as though against the night air. It was the same coat Draycott had worn when Purbright met him days before.
"No sign of him?"
Purbright asked. "None, sir. Just the footprints. They don't go toward the water." "Show me." The constable angled the light along the bank. Two sets of prints emerged from the darkness, one leading to the spot where the coat lay, the other continuing away, deeper into the mist. The tread was narrow even, unhurried. Purbright followed their path, each step squelching softly in the damp soil. The air smelled of iron and weeds. At a bend in the towpath, the prints turned sharply, not toward the town but uphill, across the verge that bordered Crescent Road. "Toward the Pike House," Purbright said quietly. Love shifted uneasily. "You think he went there again? Or was expected?" They followed the tracks to where the path met the road, and there the mud gave way to cobble. The trail vanished. Purbright stood for a moment, his coat darkened by the rain, eyes fixed on the faint glow of a single lamp burning behind the pike curtains. It was nearly 2 o'clock when he knocked. The sound was discreet, yet its echoes seemed to travel unnaturally far, as though the night itself were listening. After a pause, the light inside flickered, and the door opened just wide enough to reveal Mrs. Pike, her face pale, hair unpinned, and eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. "Inspector," she whispered, "you shouldn't be here at this hour." "Nor should he," Purbright replied softly. Her hand tightened on the edge of the door. "What do you mean?" "Your husband's coat has been found again, all at the canal, but his footprints lead here." For a heartbeat she said nothing. Then, with an effort that looked like surrender, she stepped aside. "Come in," she said. The house was colder than before. The fire had gone out, leaving a faint smell of damp ash. The only light came from a lamp on the sideboard, its shade tilted, throwing long, slanting shadows across the room. "Where is he, Mrs. Pike?" Purbright asked quietly. She pressed her hands together. "If you mean Leonard, I don't know."
"I haven't seen him since that day at the bridge." "Then you won't mind if we look around." Her mouth opened, as if to protest, then closed again.
She nodded once. "If you must." Love moved quietly through the house while Purbright remained in the sitting room. He studied the mantelpiece. The photograph of her wedding to Mr. Pike had been turned face down. Beside it, a faint smear of soil marred the polished wood. "Did your husband return tonight?" he asked. She shook her head. "Albert's still in Nottingham. He sent a wire." Purbright's gaze lingered on the overturned frame.
"And Leonard?"
Her breath caught.
"You think he's here?"
"I think he was," said Purbright. "And if he isn't now, someone else may have helped him leave again." From upstairs came the sound of a door opening, then Love's voice, subdued. "So you might want to see this." Purbright followed him up the narrow staircase. The air grew colder. At the landing's end, a door stood ajar to what had once been a spare room. Inside, the faint smell of damp earth mingled with something sharper. Smoke, perhaps, or decay. On the floor lay muddy footprints, faint but distinct, leading from the window to the center of the room. There, half hidden beneath a discarded blanket, was a bundle of clothing, a man's shirt, collar stained and sleeves torn. "Found this behind the curtain," Love said quietly, handing Purbright a small, folded paper. "Matches the handwriting from the first note." Purbright unfolded it carefully. "The same neat hand, the same composure, forgive me."
"I should not have come back."
"Tell Evelyn the water remembers." He read it twice, then slipped it into his pocket. "Nothing else?"
"Only this," Love said, gesturing to the window.
The latch was open, the sill wet with rain. Below, the garden stretched away in dim light. Soil churned and uneven, the same patches Purbright had noticed that morning. He turned to Mrs. Pike, who stood at the doorway, her face drained of colour. "Why was this room disturbed?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then whispered, "It was his study, Leonard's. I never changed it. Albert doesn't come in here." Yet someone did. She swayed slightly, catching the doorframe for balance.
"Inspector!"
If he was alive, why come back now? Why here? Purbright looked toward the open window. The wind stirred the curtain, carrying the faint smell of the garden. Wet earth and roots newly cut. "Because," he said quietly, "the past always returns to the place that profited from it." Downstairs, the clock struck 3. Its chime was flat, hesitant, as if reluctant to announce the hour. Purbright drew the blanket back over the clothes and moved to the window. In the garden below, the rain had stopped, but the earth glistened darkly under the lamplight. He thought of the spade against the fence, of the roses too new for October, and of the quiet, patient way Flaxborough accepted its secrets until they began to move beneath the soil. As they left the house, Mrs. Pike's voice followed him down the hall. "Will you find him?" Purbright paused at the door. "That depends," he said, "on whether he wishes to be found, or buried properly this time." Outside, the mist was lifting, leaving behind a faint glimmer of moonlight. It fell softly across the garden, revealing what the darkness had hidden: a patch of disturbed earth near the hedge, shallow, freshly turned, the kind that wouldn't take much rain to yield its contents. Purbright watched in silence. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell quiet. The canal murmured its endless refrain, and for a long moment, all of Flaxborough seemed to listen with him, waiting as the light began, slowly, to change. By morning, the mist had cleared, leaving a strange, exhausted brightness over Flaxborough, a light that flattened colours and made the town look faintly unreal, as though its facades had been repainted overnight. The canal glimmered in the distance, harmless again in the daylight, and yet Purbright could not quite believe in its innocence. He sat at his desk, coat still damp at the shoulders, staring at the note Sergeant Love had placed before him. It had arrived an hour earlier, hand-delivered, slipped through the letter slot without witness. The envelope was plain, the handwriting neat and deliberate. He unfolded it carefully. "The wages of deceit is remembrance." No signature.
No address.
Just the line penned with the calm certainty of someone who understood its weight. Love stood nearby, chewing thoughtfully on the end of a pencil. That's scripture, isn't it, sir?
Almost, Purbright said.
It's a bastard child of Corinthians and local invention. What's it mean, you think? Purbright leaned back, fingers steepled. That whoever wrote it knows more about this affair than they're admitting, and has a taste for irony. Deceit and remembrance, love, two of Flaxborough's chief exports. Love smiled faintly. You think it's Mrs. Pike? She's not that self-aware, Purbright replied. Besides, her conscience, if she has one, would choose a more forgiving text. He turned the paper over, studied the faint indentation of the pen strokes against the fibres. Whoever wrote it had a steady hand and time to spare. Postmark? He asked. None. Must have been delivered in person. Purbright glanced toward the window. Outside, the street was quiet, a milk cart rattling distantly down Market Lane. Then our ghost, or one of his accomplices, prefers discretion. It's curious, isn't it? A man presumed drowned, reappears alive, vanishes again, and now his handwriting, or something close to it, floats back to us like driftwood. Love hesitated. You think it's him writing these? Purbright's eyes softened with something between pity and curiosity.
If the dead wrote letters, love, the postal service would have collapsed years ago.
But I'll grant that whoever penned this wishes us to think so. He rose and crossed to the window. The light had shifted slightly. Not warmer, just clearer, the sort of clarity that reveals things better left indistinct. You know, he said quietly, the dead only return when the living invite them, sometimes out of guilt, sometimes fear.
And sometimes, he paused, watching a pair of children run past the gate, their laughter a fragile echo in the cold air. Out of habit. Love blinked.
Habit, sir? People miss their misdeeds, said Purbright. They revisit them like fond places. That's what makes Flaxborough such a comfortable town. Everyone's crime is a memory before it's discovered. He turned back to the desk, the letter still between his fingers. What did the search at the Pike house turn up? Nothing conclusive, said Love. The garden's been dug recently, but the soil's too soaked to tell for certain. We'll have to wait for it to dry before we can go at it properly. And Mrs. Pike? She's keeping to her room. Vicar called on her this morning. Said she was in a state of prayerful exhaustion. Purbright smiled without mirth. Flaxborough's favourite diagnosis. He walked to the cabinet and retrieved the Draycott file once more, its corners softened by use. I've been thinking, he said slowly, about motive. Not the usual sort, not money or malice. Something subtler, Love frowned. You mean guilt? Close, said Purbright. Remorse, perhaps, though remorse seldom travels alone. He flipped open the file, spreading its pages across the desk once more. His gaze lingered on a single line in the coroner's report. Evidence consistent with accidental death. No suspicion of foul play. The words, so tidy, seemed almost indecent now. Suppose, Purbright said quietly. Leonard Draycott didn't die by accident. Suppose his disappearance was contrived, and not merely to cheat an insurance company. Suppose it was an agreement. Love's brow furrowed.
Oh, you mean between him and Mrs. Pike?
Between him and someone else, perhaps? Someone with more to lose if he stayed. He closed the file with a soft snap. You see, Love, a drowning is a wonderfully convenient death. No corpse, no autopsy, no awkward explanations. Just an empty space where a man used to be, and a cheque to fill it. He turned toward the window again. Outside, the rain had begun once more. Not the steady downpour of the previous night, but a thin, uncertain drizzle, drifting like breath on glass. But when the water gives back what it was promised, there's always a reckoning. That's what this note is. A reminder. Love shifted uneasily. You think he's dead for real this time? Purbright smiled faintly. In Flaxborough, reality is largely a matter of consensus. If enough people believe a man's dead, he generally obliges. He reached for his coat. Come along, love. Let's take a walk to the churchyard. The churchyard, sir? Mrs. Pike's first funeral took place there, did it not?
I'd like to see how thoroughly the town buried its doubts. The rain thickened as they walked, turning the pavement slick.
The church loomed ahead. St. Jude's, squat and resolute, its stones darkened by age and weather. The graveyard behind it was small, hemmed in by hedges and the quiet patience of forgotten names. They found the headstone easily enough. Leonard Draycott, 1929–1960, beloved husband. At rest, the engraving was shallow, the stone modest. Fitting, murmured Purbright.
Even his death was economical, Love frowned.
Strange, though, isn't it, sir?
A headstone for a man without a body. Flaxborough likes symbols, Love. They spare one the trouble of meaning. Purbright knelt, brushing a stray leaf from the base.
The soil beneath was undisturbed, the sort of stillness only long acceptance brings. He straightened, brushing his hands. Nothing to find here, he said softly, which is precisely what someone intended. As they turned to leave, the wind carried a sound from the far edge of the churchyard, a faint clatter, metal against stone. They paused. In the shadow of the boundary wall stood the caretaker, old man stooped beneath his oilskin coat. He gave a polite nod as they approached. "Morning, Inspector," he said, voice gravelly.
"Didn't expect company this early." "Nor we yours," said Purbright.
"Quite night?" The man hesitated, then scratched the back of his neck. "Mostly, except for someone down by the gate."
"Thought it was a tramp."
"Came round just after midnight, left something on your motor car." Purbright's expression did not change. "Something?"
"An envelope."
"Didn't see who it was. Fog was thick." Back at the car, a single white envelope waited beneath the wiper. Purbright lifted it carefully. The handwriting was the same, deliberate, graceful, and unhurried. He opened it. "You buried me twice."
Once was kindness.
The second was convenience. The rain fell harder now, hissing softly on the stones around them. Purbright folded the note with care and slipped it into his pocket. "Well," he said quietly, "our ghost is nothing if not articulate." Love looked at him uneasily. "What do we do now, sir?" Purbright glanced toward the church, its windows reflecting pale light. "We wait," he said. "The dead are remarkably patient, and the living less so. That's where the truth begins to show." The bell struck noon, its sound carrying over the damp air, solemn and clear. As it faded, the inspector and his sergeant stood by the empty grave, the rain whispering over their coats, and the town, polite as ever, went on pretending nothing at all was amiss. The following afternoon arrived soft and uncertain,
as though the weather itself were holding its breath.
Flaxborough had returned to its usual tempo, polite, punctual, slightly deaf to disturbance, yet there was an unease beneath the clatter of teacups and shop bells, like a tune everyone remembered, but no one wished to hum. Inspector Purbright walked the narrow lane toward Crescent Road with a measured calm that might have passed for indifference, had it not been for the faint tightening at the corner of his mouth. A constable had confirmed the postmark on the latest letter, none, delivered by hand again. He suspected the author's route had been shorter than expected. At Mrs. Pike's house, the front curtains were drawn halfway, admitting light in cautious portions. He knocked once, then again, the sound dulled by the damp air. After a pause, footsteps approached. Careful, unhurried. The door opened. She was dressed in mourning black once more, though it was not quite the colour of grief.
"Rather, it suggested preparation." "Inspector," she said, voice low but steady.
"I wondered when you'd come back." "Flaxborough has a way of wondering the same thing about its ghosts," he replied. "May I?" She hesitated, then stepped aside. The hallway was dim, the scent of tea faintly masking something sharper beneath. Polish, perhaps, or smoke. A small fire burned in the sitting room, its glow casting a restless shimmer across the framed photographs. The one of her and Leonard had been restored to its upright place on the mantelpiece. "I thought you might join me for tea," Purbright said, setting his hat gently on the stand. "It seems the town's preferred medium for revelation." Her lips curved faintly. "You expect one?" He smiled. "Revelation?"
"Always confession. Only if the tea's good." She poured carefully, her hands steady in motion, but not in temperature.
The faint tremor of porcelain betrayed her. They sat opposite one another, the fire between them crackling softly, the clock ticking in decorous rhythm. "I had a letter this morning," Purbright began. No signature, thoughtful penmanship. It accused someone, perhaps you, perhaps itself, of burying a man twice. Kindness first, convenience second. Her eyes flickered toward the fire. "You think I wrote it?" "I think you're tired of being silent." She gave a small, humorless laugh. "Tiredness and guilt are not the same thing, Inspector." "No," he agreed. "But one is often mistaken for the other." He took a sip of tea. "You once told me Leonard was weak."
"That you pitied him." "That when the canal claimed him, you were relieved." "I wonder if that's entirely true." She looked up sharply.
"You think I loved him?" "I think you loved what he might have been, before the debts, before the desperation. And perhaps you loved the peace his absence gave you more than the man himself." The words lingered in the quiet. The rain tapped softly at the window pane, patient, rhythmic. "I don't know what you want from me," she said finally. "The truth," Purbright replied gently. "Not the polite kind, wrapped in social paper. The kind that stains." Her gaze drifted to the window. "It began with his job," she said at last, the words arriving as though drawn reluctantly from some deep, still place. He'd been caught mismanaging accounts at the firm. Nothing criminal, not quite. Just foolishness, pride. He borrowed against the house to repay what he owed, but it wasn't enough. He said he'd lose everything, his position, our name. I told him we could start again. He said he couldn't bear to start anything where people knew him. Purbright listened without interruption, his eyes soft but intent. "One night," she continued, "he came home late, said he'd thought of a way out. Not suicide, not really, something cleverer. He'd leave his coat and wallet by the canal. The water would do the rest. He said if I played the grieving widow properly, the insurance would take care of us both." Her voice caught slightly on the last word. "Both?" she repeated, as if deceit could be shared evenly. Purbright set his cup down, the porcelain sound deliberate and small. "You agreed." "I did," she whispered. "I told myself it was mercy."
"He was breaking and She pressed a hand to her temple.
"He promised it would be quick, that he'd go abroad, start over. I would wait, then follow. But he never wrote. I thought perhaps he'd changed his mind, or died after all. Then I met Albert. He was kind, steady. He believed the official story, and so did I."
After a time, the fire cracked softly, throwing a brief shimmer across her face, a brief echo of the younger woman she had once been. Purbright leaned forward slightly. "And then?"
"2 weeks ago," she said, her tone flattening into something almost numb, "Leonard appeared at my door, not in the flesh of a ghost, but near enough, older, thinner, with that same apologetic smile he wore when asking for money. He said he'd been living quietly in Ipswich, that he wanted no trouble, only what was owed, a little each month, to stay gone." "Blackmail, then," Purbright said softly. "He called it restitution. Said he was entitled to something for being dead all these years. And did you pay him?" "I told him I needed time to think. That was the last I saw him." She looked toward the mantelpiece, at the picture's half-smile. "Until you came last night?" Purbright considered her in silence, his expression unreadable.
"And your husband?" "Albert knows nothing."
"He mustn't. He believes the past is tidy." Purbright stood, walking slowly toward the window. Outside, the rain had turned to mist again, blurring the garden's edges until nothing looked entirely solid. "You realize, Mrs. Pike," he said quietly, "that Leonard's disappearance, his second one, cannot remain unexamined. Someone helped him vanish. perhaps unwillingly. Her breath caught.
You think I think, Purbright interrupted gently.
That when a man like Leonard Draycott pushes too far,
Even sympathy has a breaking point. She rose unsteadily, one hand gripping the arm of her chair.
you can't prove anything. He turned, his face calm, his tone soft as before. Proof, Mrs. Pike, is an overrated commodity. But truth has a scent. It lingers like smoke after a fire. One can smell it long after the flames have been doused. Her eyes filled then, not with defiance, but something older, wearier.
He came that night, she whispered. I thought I could reason with him.
I went into the garden. The rain was starting. He said he wouldn't leave without money. I told him I had none. He laughed. Purbright waited. I pushed him, she said at last. It wasn't much. Just enough. He slipped. The earth was wet. There was no sound, just the fall. The fire popped once, the sound small and merciless. I buried him myself, she said.
Under the roses.
He'd always said they'd outlast everything. Purbright remained still, his expression a blend of pity and inevitability. And the letters? He must have written them before that night. He liked words that sounded important.
He thought they'd make him immortal. Purbright nodded slowly.
In Flaxborough, they just make you gossip. He picked up his hat, smoothing its brim absently.
You'll make your statement tomorrow morning.
Quietly, if you wish.
Sergeant Love will come for you.
The roses can wait until then. She sank into her chair, staring at the fire as though it might offer some alternate ending. Purbright moved to the door. One last thing, he said, pausing.
Why did you agree to help him all those years ago?
Her answer came barely above a whisper.
Because I thought dying would make him honest. Purbright inclined his head.
In that, Mrs. Pike, you may finally have been right. He stepped out into the fading light, the mist thickening once more along the canal road. The town was quiet again, polite as ever, its windows glowing faintly like watchful eyes. Somewhere behind him, a clock struck 4. The sound carried gently through the fog, each chime softening until it was only memory, steady, circular, unending. By the next morning, Flaxborough had quietly rearranged itself around the latest event,
as it always did, with the brisk efficiency of a housemaid sweeping dust beneath a rug.
The rain had passed, leaving the pavements rinsed and shining, and the air smelled faintly of soap and chimney smoke. Inspector Purbright sat in his office, reading the single column in the Flaxborough Chronicle. Local misunderstanding cleared up. A brief disturbance regarding the identity of a returned traveller has now been amicably resolved. Authorities confirm no wrongdoing. Residents are reminded to exercise restraint in matters of speculation. He folded the paper carefully and laid it aside. Restraint, he murmured. Flaxborough's favourite virtue, second only to denial. Sergeant Love entered, balancing 2 cups of tea. Papers out, sir. Whole thing tucked away neat as you like. No names, no fuss. Mrs. Pike's gone quietly, just as you said. Purbright nodded. Good, let her rest a while. The law's appetite for spectacle won't be fed here. Love hesitated, lowering his voice. They found him then? Properly this time? Properly, said Purbright. Under the roses, just as she said.
Neatly folded into the earth, like a story no one wants to reread, Love frowned. A funny thing, though, isn't it?
No one in town seemed shocked. Almost as if they'd known all along, Purbright smiled faintly. They probably did. In Flaxborough, knowledge is like bad wallpaper. Everyone sees it, no one mentions it. He sipped his tea, the taste steady and plain. I've sent word to the coroner.
No inquest.
He'll rule it accidental, which is near enough the truth. A fall in the rain, a woman alone, a mistake that lasted too long.
There's decency in that sort of fiction. Love looked out the window.
The canal shimmered faintly through the mist, its surface calm once more. And the letters? Stopped, Purbright said. As ghosts usually do once they've been given their due, they sat in companionable quiet. The clock ticked, the radiator hissed, and somewhere outside a church bell tolled 11. "I'll say this, sir," Love began after a pause. "You've a knack for ending things without making them sound like endings." Purbright smiled at that. A small, private thing. "That's because in towns like ours, Love, nothing really ends. It simply resumes a more acceptable form." He rose, pulling on his coat.
"I think I'll walk to the high street. Fresh air and a show of normality," Love grinned.
"You mean to show the town its policemen still keeping order?" "Precisely," said Purbright, reaching for his hat. "Flaxborough sleeps best when it knows it's being observed." Outside, the air was crisp, the light soft as candle wax. Market stalls were being set up again. Apples, scones, cabbages, all the familiar certainties. Mrs. Glossop stood at her usual post by the greengrocer's, recounting to an audience of two that the poor woman at Crescent Road had mistaken a stranger for her late husband. Dreadful business, really, but one must expect odd things at this time of year. Purbright caught her eye and offered a courteous nod. She blushed faintly and turned back to her apples. Gossip in Flaxborough was like ivy. It shrank from pruning, but always grew back quietly. He walked on toward the canal bridge, where the water now carried a few scattered leaves and the faint reflection of a clearing sky. The place looked ordinary again, almost innocent. Even the rail where Draycott's coat had once hung was dry now, its iron darkened by time and nothing more. Purbright paused there a moment, his hands resting lightly on the railing. Somewhere nearby a sparrow fluttered through the reeds. The town stretched behind him, unchanged or pretending to be. He spoke softly, as though to the water itself. "Rest now, Mr. Draycott. You've travelled far enough." The words seemed to dissolve in the air, carried off by a passing breeze that smelt faintly of damp leaves and morning bread. By the time he returned to the station, the town was already folding the matter away into its private history. The Chronicle would move on to a garden show or the mayor's luncheon. Mrs. Pike would vanish from conversation as politely as she had from sight. Even the roses come spring would bloom without hesitation. In his office, the desk stood tidy once more. The Draycott file, now closed and labelled, waited to be stored. Purbright picked it up, weighing it briefly in his hand, then slid it into the cabinet marked Miscellaneous. It joined a dozen others, thin, unassuming volumes of quiet disorder, neatly resolved. He lingered a moment longer, studying the faint dust on the window ledge. The canal's reflection shimmered faintly beyond the glass. "The wages of deceit," he murmured, "are never quite spent." Love appeared at the doorway, hat in hand. "Anything more for today, sir?" "No," Purbright said. "Let's give the town a day of peace."
"It's earned one," Love nodded, hesitated.
"You'll be at the vicar's tea this afternoon?" "Of course," Purbright replied. A little moral refreshment after all this mortality. When the sergeant had gone, Purbright stood alone for a time, listening to the quiet hum of the office. It was the kind of stillness that follows a story properly ended, calm, unshowy, and faintly melancholy. He turned off the lamp and stepped into the corridor. Outside, the church bell struck noon again, the sound softer now, as though remembering itself. Flaxborough went on breathing, politely, steadily, and the canal kept its silence. Purbright walked home beneath the thinning mist, his coat brushing against the damp hedges, his step unhurried. Behind him, the last of the rainwater trickled into the drains, vanishing without fuss. The town, it seemed, had restored itself, and that, Purbright thought with quiet satisfaction, was the closest thing to justice it ever truly desired. By the week's end, the fog had lifted. The air had that thin, brittle clarity peculiar to English autumns, sharp enough to remind one of mortality, soft enough to make it tolerable. The canal, recently so secretive, now lay open and untroubled beneath the low sun, its surface glassy, indifferent. Children played along its edge again, their laughter bouncing across the water like small, irreverent stones. Inspector Purbright stood by his office window, watching them. From this height, the figures looked distant. Bright coats, skipping feet, the clatter of marbles on cobbles. The sort of scene that reassured Flaxborough it was still a good, law-abiding place. He reached into his pocket and drew out the last of the unsigned letters. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges. The ink, once black, had softened to brown. He read the line again, "The wages of deceit is remembrance," then folded it once, neatly, and slipped it back. On his desk, the kettle murmured. Sergeant Love entered, his usual careful tread softened by the carpet. "Morning, sir." "Crisp out there. Smells like the world's been scrubbed clean," Purbright smiled faintly. "The world, perhaps. Not the conscience." Love set down 2 mugs and joined him at the window.
Kids are back at the canal. Parents must have decided it's safe again. Parents, Purbright said, are professional forgetters.
How else would civilization continue? Love chuckled, then sobered. Funny thing, isn't it? All that business, why, the coat, the letters, the garden.
And now nothing. Like it never happened. In Flaxborough, said Purbright, nothing ever happens, officially. They stood for a while, the quiet filled by the faint whistle of wind along the roof tiles.
Across the street, Mrs. Glossop was hanging washing again, the white sheets flapping like flags of surrender. The Chronicle van had just passed, its back door open, scattering fresh pages to be read and soon forgotten. Love cleared his throat. "You reckon she'll stay in prison long?" "Long enough to learn silence," said Purbright. "Though she already knows the language." "A year, perhaps?" "2, if someone decides to be conscientious." "Poor woman." "Not poor," Purbright said gently. "Just overdrawn, morally speaking." Love gave a small, uncertain smile. "You've a way of putting things, sir." "Bad habit of clarity," Purbright replied. "You'll develop it too if you're not careful." The clock on the wall chimed 10. The sound drifted through the open window, mingling with the thin music of the morning, a dog barking, a bicycle bell, the faint slap of oars on water. Life, orderly once more. Purbright returned to his desk, sorting through a modest pile of reports. Petty theft, a dispute over hens, a missing bicycle. Flaxborough's preferred misdeeds. Each paper restored him slightly, a reminder that the world's sins were mostly small, tidy, and recoverable. Love lingered by the door. "You'll be at the mayor's tea, sir?"
"They're saying he's got his eye on retirement." "I'll attend," said Purbright.
It would be discourteous not to witness another burial. Civic this time. Love grinned, then left, his footsteps fading down the corridor. Purbright leaned back, eyes half closed. The sunlight had found its way across the floorboards, warming the room's edges. Somewhere below, the typewriter in records tapped in slow, thoughtful bursts. The smell of ink and damp wool filled the air. He thought of Mrs. Pike. The quiet dignity with which she had accepted the inevitable, the way she had folded her hands when the statement was done. He thought of Leonard Draycott, half dream, half man, rising from his own deceit, only to drown in it at last. And he thought of the town, its immaculate hedges, its polished brass knockers, its extraordinary gift for smoothing the rough edges of truth. Perhaps that, he reflected, was the true character of Flaxborough, a place where decency served as camouflage and mercy arrived in bureaucratic envelopes. Outside, the children's laughter rose again, joined by the faint hum of a passing motorcar. The sound carried a kind of optimism, light and careless. It drifted through the open window, brushing against the stillness of the room before dissolving into it. Purbright rose, turned down the flame beneath the kettle, and watched the last curl of steam fade into the air. The moment stretched, neither content nor uneasy, just balanced, like the town itself, perpetually poised between what was known and what was politely ignored. He moved back to the window one last time. The sunlight had shifted, striking the water at an angle that turned it briefly gold. A breeze stirred the reeds along the bank, bending them, then letting them rise again. Peaceful, he murmured, though he knew it was not quite the same as peace. He allowed himself a small sigh, the kind that carried no weariness, only recognition. Then he turned from the window, straightened the papers on his desk, and adjusted his hat. Outside, the church bell began its slow,
measured toll, a sound neither mournful nor celebratory.
Merely inevitable. Inspector Purbright listened until the last note faded, leaving only silence and the faint ticking of the clock. He smiled, a quiet,
private smile, and stepped into the light. Goodbye.